through Irish airports or airspace in the past 5 years. And let me go to Deputy Catherine Connolly, who joins me on the line. Well, Catherine, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, good to imagine again.
But first, you were in Shannon yesterday.
I was.
Yeah.
I was. I felt it was important to go down and stand in solidarity with those that believe that Shannon Airport should not be used to allow American troops to pass through on their way to war.
Now, there's been a lot of, including in Claire Daly and Mick Wallace and indeed Margareta Darcy and others asking questions indeed of the Irish government, not Shannon Airport, the Irish government on this. But I mean, it's been confirmed 750,000. Some of them were carrying weapons and that. But this was approved by the Minister for Transport, Shane Ross.
Yeah,
why not the Minister for Justice or Defence?
Yeah, I actually, Keith, I don't know how much time I have, but it's quite complex and quite simple. And there are two systems. And civilian aircraft is being used by American Army to come through Shannon with permission. Now, first of all, over 3 million US troops have passed through Shannon Airport on the way to and from the Middle East since 2002. 3 million troops. That's the first statistic, in addition to what you're reading out for the last 5 years, 750,000 foreign troops. The vast majority are American. And the highest point was in 2005 when 341,000 troops passed through. And this year now we're going to approach 100,000. In the first 3 years of this year, almost 25,000 troops. So we'll approach 100,000. And what people don't realise is that you cannot pass through Shannon Airport without permission. And these are civilian aircraft with military. And they need to get permission, as you said, from the Minister for Transport, and he's allowed to give exemptions. And so it's governed by a particular act, which I won't go into. But what's important is that act prohibits the carrying of munitions of war through Irish airports or airspace, except where the Minister for Transport has given an exemption. And so the Minister and previous ministers have always given exemptions to allow troops to pass through with arms. Now, there are some conditions in relation to the arms that they shouldn't be live and they should be properly hidden and so on. But he gives permission. Now, it's interesting, the Minister for Transport has said that he has exercised his discretion from 2016 onwards in a number of cases where he said, no, you're not bringing on explosives. Can you imagine? It's okay to bring on the guns and all the other weapons, but he was strong enough, he said, to say no to explosives. Okay, and he stopped explosives going on planes and being allowed to go through Shannon.
But now you said they're civilian operators with military on board, so effectively they're charter planes.
Yes, there are two aspects, and they're governed under two different ministers, to answer your question. So one is civilian aircraft carrying army personnel comes under the Minister for Transport, because they're civilian, and he's allowed to give exemptions. And that has been happening on a regular basis since 2002. Separately then, actual military aircraft, come under the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And
not the Minister for Defence?
No. Okay. And the biggest, besides the numbers, besides the fact that we're absolutely colluding in wars across the world, and you've seen on the map today, which I don't have in front of me, but it's on the screen, where the American troops are going, and going to a surprisingly number of countries. So we're actually colluding with war abroad, and we're a neutral country, and yet we're facilitating the murder and slaughter of innocent people. And what's really significant in the last 100 years is that in every war, it's more and more civilians are dying as opposed to soldiers or paid mercenaries. In previous wars, in a previous time, soldiers died, which was unacceptable, but soldiers and mercenaries. Now it starts with women, children, men, and then the army. And we're getting more and more wars by remote control, by the press of a button, by drones, and so on. And Shannon, unfortunately, is an absolute integral part of that. I have before me, I looked just prior to the interview to look, back in 2007, a report by the European Parliament expressed serious concern about 147 stopovers made by CIA-operated aircraft at Irish airport. I beg your pardon, there was extraordinary rendition. You remember that word?
Yes.
It's gone out of usage now.
Yeah.
But rendition
I've written down here. in front of me,
huge concern expressed by the Parliament, huge concern expressed in 2011 by the UN Committee Against Torture about Ireland's alleged cooperation in a rendition programme. That means carrying prisoners tied and gagged on their way to be tortured or coming from a place where they had been tortured, and all facilitated through Shannon.
Can I ask, is it only Shannon, or are they going into the likes of Ireland, West Airport, Knock? Are they going into Dublin? Are they going into
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, which I'll double check.
I'm not focusing on Shannon. I suppose they're getting a directive from the government.
I'm afraid Shannon is the major international airport for the stopovers.
It's also a major international airport for us as well, you see.
Well, this is interesting now. I have information before me. On any given night, there are more military aircraft or more civilian aircraft carrying military than there are ordinary flights. So we've set up Shannon now to depend on our collusion with war, actually, abroad. And I don't think people realise that. And actually, I was down in Shannon yesterday, and I heard the people being interviewed in relation to the President of America coming, and the employment he's providing, and how grateful for they are that, and how they're dependent on that. And I fully understand that. In my 3 years in the Dáil, outside of health and housing, the divide between the city and the rural areas has been brought into the most acute focus. And quite clearly, we're letting down our rural areas. There is no balanced sustainable development. And if anything, that's what was obvious yesterday from Doonbeg, that area, successive governments have let down amongst other areas, and they're utterly dependent on Donald Trump to provide employment in that area. It's an argument for another day and a discussion for another day.
Can I ask you, just in relation to the use of Shannon then, is it because they've got US immigration there, that when people are going back home to the States or wherever, that they can clear immigration in Shannon? Is that why Shannon is being used?
No, they're two separate things.
No, but I mean, if they're heading home rather than bringing them into New York and having to go through, or wherever they go into. I'm just wondering, is the magnet of Shannon the fact that there is immigration there? They can clear immigration.
The magnet of Shannon is that a deal was done back in 2002 when the government took a decision following 9/11 in 2001, and prior to the illegal invasion of Iraq. The Irish government took a decision to provide landing and refueling facilities to the US military at the airport. And the US military come into the Shannon and through our airspace with the collusion of the government, either in civilian aircraft or in military aircraft. And at any given time, the numbers vary enormously. But what doesn't vary is that over 3 million troops with their personal weapons have passed through the airport on their way to various other countries. And it reached its peak in 2005 with 341,000. And now we're nearly up to 100,000 again. But in the middle of all of this, even if one was in agreement with that, with the decision made then, there is a complete absence of inspection facilities. Nobody is checking, are the aircraft, military or civilian, complying with the rules.
And what department would that come under? Justice?
It comes under both departments. Both departments have a responsibility. They give permission with certain conditions, and those conditions must be complied with. But we're utterly reliant on the assurances given to us by the Americans that they're complying. Now we're in a time of fake news. We're in a time of spin, and we know that. We're all condemning Trump because he's the master of spin and fake news, and yet we're utterly reliant on his regime when they tell us they're compliant with the rules and regulations. And the ministers, I mean, Claire Daly, I have to pay tribute to her, and Mick Wallace have been extraordinarily active in response to the courageous people on the ground. Margaretta Darcy, Niall Farrell, I could list them out. They, at great cost to themselves, have spent a huge part of their lifespan monitoring the situation on the ground, including Ed Horgan, to give us factual information that should be provided by the government.
Well, let's throw it back to the government, but thank you for joining us today. Catherine Connolly, Deputy Catherine Connolly, joining us.